In the North Atlantic, Russia wasn't just watching HMS Queen Elizabeth, it was waiting for her to blink. Warships deployed, submarines positioned, aircraft scrambled. Every move calculated to intimidate the most powerful carrier Britain had ever built. Russia had done this before. It had worked before. But this time, something was different. This time, the Royal Navy had already decided exactly what it was going to do, and Russia had no idea. It started quietly, the way most dangerous things do. In the summer of 2021, HMS Queen Elizabeth left Portsmouth with the largest British naval task force assembled in decades. 6 warships, a submarine, destroyer escorts, fighter jets on deck. The whole formation stretched across miles of open ocean. Britain hadn't sent anything like this in 20 years. The world noticed. Moscow noticed most of all. The carrier strike group's mission was straightforward on paper, a deployment through the Mediterranean into the Indo-Pacific, showing the flag, running exercises, demonstrating that Britain still had reach, still had power, still mattered on the global stage. For a country that had spent years debating its place in the world after Brexit, this deployment was more than military, it was a statement. Russia read that statement very carefully. Within days of the task force leaving port, Russian intelligence assets began moving. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just quietly repositioning, the way professional militaries do when something significant is happening nearby. Satellite passes increased over the carrier group's projected route. Russian naval vessels that had been sitting in port suddenly found reasons to be at sea. Aircraft that had been grounded began filing flight plans toward the North Atlantic. Moscow had a playbook for moments like this. It had used it before against American carriers, against NATO exercises, against any demonstration of Western naval power that came too close to Russian interests. The playbook was simple: shadow the force. Make your presence known. Let them feel watched. Let them feel followed. Create enough psychological pressure that decisions become harder, movements become more cautious, and the message to the world becomes muddled. If Britain wanted to project power, Russia would project doubt. The first Russian vessel made contact with the carrier group 3 days into the deployment. It wasn't a warship initially. It was an intelligence gathering ship, the kind Russia operates across every ocean, bristling with antennas, packed with electronic monitoring equipment, designed to sit close to military formations and absorb everything. Radio frequencies, radar signatures, communication patterns, engine noise profiles. Every piece of information fed back to analysts who spent their careers building pictures of how Western navies operated, where their gaps were, what their commanders tended to do under pressure. The intelligence ship took up position and stayed there. On HMS Queen Elizabeth, the crew tracked it without drama. This was not their first encounter with Russian surveillance vessels. Most senior sailors had seen this before in various forms throughout their careers. The Russians watching, the British watching the Russians watching, both sides logging everything, neither side particularly surprised. It was a ritual as old as the Cold War, updated for the 21st century, but fundamentally unchanged. What changed in the days that followed was the scale. A second Russian vessel appeared. Then reports began filtering through of submarine activity in the region. Not confirmed, not close enough to be certain, but the signature patterns were there for anyone trained to read them. Somewhere beneath the surface, something was moving parallel to the carrier group's course. The underwater picture, as sailors call it, was becoming complicated. Above the surface, Russian aircraft began making appearances. The first pass was almost casual. A maritime patrol aircraft, the kind Russia uses to monitor shipping lanes and track naval movements, appeared on radar well outside any confrontation range and flew a long, slow arc around the task force before departing. Professional. Measured. Exactly. The kind of move designed to say, "We see you," without saying anything at all. But the message was received. Inside the carrier's operations room, a picture was forming that went beyond simple surveillance. Russia wasn't just watching HMS Queen Elizabeth, it was building a comprehensive intelligence profile of the entire task force. How the destroyers positioned themselves, how the submarine communicated, how the combat air patrol operated, how the formation responded to outside contacts. Every piece of information was valuable. Every pattern observed was a weakness potentially identified. For the officers tracking this from inside the carrier group, the situation raised questions that had no comfortable answers. How much were the Russians learning? How much of what they were learning would change future calculations? And underneath both of those questions, a more immediate concern. Russia wasn't just collecting information, it was sending a message to every navy in the world watching this deployment. Britain's most powerful warship, the centerpiece of a billion-pound investment, the symbol of Royal Navy resurgence, could be followed, could be tracked, could be made to feel exposed in open water, surrounded by assets it couldn't fully account for, moving through an environment that Russia was shaping as much as Britain was. The shadow had fallen across HMS Queen Elizabeth, and in Moscow, analysts were already waiting to see what Britain would do next. They were about to find out. There is a moment in every confrontation where watching becomes a choice. HMS Queen Elizabeth had been watched long enough. The decision didn't come with drama. No emergency meetings, no raised voices in operations rooms, no signals fired across the fleet in a panic. That is not how professional militaries operate, and the Royal Navy had been a professional military for 300 years. What came instead was something quieter, and in many ways far more dangerous to Russian calculations. A change in behavior. For days, the carrier strike group had moved through its planned route, tracking Russian assets, logging their positions, feeding information back through intelligence channels, and doing nothing that could be interpreted as escalatory. That restraint had been deliberate. Commanders understood that Russia was probing for reactions, testing how the task force responded to pressure, looking for patterns in decision-making that could be exploited later. The best response to that kind of probing is often no visible response at all. But invisible responses are a different matter entirely. Beneath the surface, the British submarine attached to the carrier group had been quietly repositioning, not dramatically, not in any way the Russian intelligence ship sitting on the horizon could easily detect, just small adjustments, course changes that made sense on their own, but together told a different story. The submarine wasn't running from Russian surveillance, it was moving around it, finding angles, creating uncertainty about its exact position, doing precisely what submarines are designed to do, making the underwater picture impossible to read clearly. For Russian analysts tracking the task force, this created an immediate problem. They had been building a comprehensive picture of the carrier group's formation, where each vessel sat relative to the others, how the defensive screen was arranged, what the gaps looked like. That picture depended on knowing where every major asset was at all times. A submarine that couldn't be precisely located was a submarine that could be anywhere. And a submarine that could be anywhere changed every calculation about how close Russian assets could safely operate. The intelligence ship on the horizon adjusted its position. It was a small movement. Anyone watching from outside might not have noticed, but inside the carrier's operations room, operators noticed immediately. The Russian vessel had been maintaining a consistent distance for days. Now it was moving further away, not retreating, not leaving, just creating a little more space between itself and a task force that had suddenly become harder to read. That was the first sign that something had shifted. The second sign came from the air. HMS Queen Elizabeth carried F-35B Lightning fighters, some of the most advanced combat aircraft Britain had ever operated. During the early days of the deployment, the combat air patrol had been running standard patterns, predictable routes, consistent altitudes, professional and efficient, but not particularly unpredictable. That changed quietly around this period. Flight patterns began varying. Patrol ranges extended further than Russian aircraft had been accounting for. Sensors that the F-35 carries, sensors that Russia had spent considerable effort trying to understand and catalogue, were being used in ways that didn't follow the patterns Russian analysts had built their assessments around. The Russians had been watching the carrier group long enough to think they understood it. They were wrong. On the surface, the destroyer escorts began running their own adjustments. Type 45 destroyers like HMS Defender, operating as part of the strike group, carry air defense systems capable of tracking hundreds of contact sites simultaneously across enormous sections of ocean and sky. Those systems had been running throughout the deployment, but now the way they were being used changed. Radar emissions that had followed predictable patterns began varying in ways that made electronic intelligence gathering significantly harder. The information Russia was collecting was becoming less reliable, without Russia being able to pinpoint exactly why. This is what modern naval competition actually looks like. Not missiles, not warning shots, not dramatic confrontations that end up in headlines. It looks like two professional militaries adjusting and readjusting in real time, each trying to understand the other, each trying to deny the other the understanding it is seeking. It is slow, technical, exhausting work, and Britain was very good at it. But there was something else happening that went beyond electronic warfare and submarine positioning. HMS Queen Elizabeth herself was changing course. Not away from Russian assets, toward them. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of unhurried confidence that only comes from knowing exactly what you are doing. The carrier didn't accelerate, didn't change her posture in any way that could be characterized as aggressive. She simply began closing the distance between herself and the Russian intelligence vessel that had been shadowing her for days. In maritime terms, the message was unmistakable. You have been watching us. Now we are going to let you watch us up close. Come and see exactly what you are dealing with. The Russian vessel slowed. For the first time since the shadowing operation had begun, Moscow's assets were no longer setting the terms of the encounter. The carrier group had taken something back, not dramatically, not in any way that would generate a diplomatic incident or a military confrontation. Just enough. Just the right amount to make every Russian commander in the region ask a question they hadn't been asking before. What exactly does the Royal Navy have planned? They didn't have an answer, and that answer piquant. Tainty was precisely the point. When you corner a bear, it doesn't retreat. It pushes back harder. Moscow was about to remind the Royal Navy exactly who it was dealing with. The response came within 48 hours. Not from the intelligence ship, not from the submarines quietly repositioning beneath the surface. It came from the air. And it came in a way that was designed to send a message that could not be misread, misinterpreted, or dismissed as routine naval activity. Russian Su-24 strike aircraft appeared on radar. Not maritime patrol planes, not reconnaissance aircraft running slow observation arcs around the task force. Strike aircraft, the kind designed to carry weapons, the kind that, in a different context, in a different set of circumstances, would represent a direct threat to surface vessels operating below them. Russia had made a calculated decision to change the nature of the message it was sending. Watching had not produced the reaction Moscow wanted, so Russia escalated the language. The aircraft came in low and fast. Inside HMS Queen Elizabeth's operations room, the contacts appeared on screens before anyone outside would have had any visual confirmation. The carrier's sensor systems, the same systems that had been quietly shifting their patterns over the previous days, were tracking every movement. Altitude, speed, heading, weapon status. Everything logged in real time, fed simultaneously to the destroyer escorts, to the submarine below, to the F-35s already airborne on combat air patrol. The crew didn't panic. Panic is trained out of naval personnel over years of exercises designed specifically to create pressure and teach people to function through it. What replaced panic was something more useful. Absolute focus. The F-35s already in the air adjusted their positions, not dramatically, not in any way that would look on radar like a scramble or an emergency response, just smooth professional repositioning. The kind that placed them exactly where they needed to be, relative to the incoming Russian aircraft. Watching, tracking, ready. On the Russian side, the Su-24 crews knew they were being tracked. They had expected to be tracked. That was part of the message. We are close enough that you have to pay attention to us. We are carrying enough capability that you cannot ignore us. We are here to remind you that this ocean does not belong exclusively to HMS Queen Elizabeth, regardless of how many destroyers she brought with her. The aircraft made their pass. Close enough to be deliberate. Far enough to remain outside any reasonable definition of hostile action. This is the precise calculation that militaries make in these situations. How close is close enough to send the message without crossing the line that turns a confrontation into an incident? Russia had done this calculation many times before. Against American carriers in the Mediterranean. Against NATO exercises in the Baltic. Against Norwegian patrol aircraft in the North Sea. Moscow was experienced at walking this particular edge. What happened next is where the encounter began to shift in ways Russia had not fully anticipated. The F-35s didn't just track the Su-24s, they followed them. Not aggressively, not in any way that could be characterized as pursuit or interception in the hostile sense. But the British aircraft stayed with the Russians longer than Russian commanders had expected, matched their movements, stayed close enough that the Su-24 crews were now the ones being observed rather than the ones doing the observing. For pilots trained in the Soviet tradition, this created a specific kind of discomfort. Russian military aviation had spent decades developing tactics based on the assumption that Western aircraft would respond in predictable ways to provocative passes. Maintain defensive positioning, shadow from a distance, avoid anything that could be characterized as escalatory. The F-35s weren't following that script. They were close. Far than they should have been by that calculation. More comfortable in that proximity than Russian crews had expected. And the technology they carried, the sensors, the electronic warfare systems, the communication capabilities, were doing things to the electronic environment around the Russian aircraft that Su-24 crews were not used to experiencing. The pass ended. The Russian aircraft departed. But the debrief that followed on the Russian side was not the debrief Moscow had planned for. Instead of reporting a successful show of force that had produced visible tension aboard the British carrier group, pilots were reporting something more complicated. The British hadn't looked pressured. The British hadn't looked uncertain. The British had looked like they had been waiting for exactly this moment and had used it to learn things about Russian aircraft and Russian tactics that they hadn't known before. Russia had flown close to HMS Queen Elizabeth to send a message. The Royal Navy had received it, filed it, and sent one back. On the surface, the carrier group continued its course. No dramatic change in formation, no visible response that Russian satellites repositioning overhead could photograph and analyze. Just a task force moving with the same steady confidence it had maintained since leaving Portsmouth. But beneath that surface, something had fundamentally changed. Russia had shown its hand. The intelligence ship, the submarines, the strike aircraft, the whole apparatus of pressure and surveillance that Moscow had deployed against the carrier group, it was all now mapped, all now understood, all now accounted for in the calculations of every commander inside that task force. Russia had been trying to make HMS Queen Elizabeth feel watched. Instead, it had handed the Royal Navy a complete picture of exactly how Russia operates when it wants to intimidate a carrier group. In military intelligence terms, that is not a small thing. That is exactly the kind of information that changes how wars are planned, how exercises are designed, how future deployments are structured. Russia had spent days collecting information about the Royal Navy. In the process, it had given the Royal Navy something potentially far more valuable. And Moscow was about to discover that the Royal Navy wasn't finished yet. Every confrontation has a moment where one side stops reacting and starts deciding. For HMS Queen Elizabeth, that moment had arrived. The carrier group had been at sea for nearly 2 weeks. Russian assets had shadowed it through the Mediterranean, tracked it through the Strait, followed it into waters that Moscow considered firmly within its sphere of influence. The intelligence ship was still there, repositioned but present. The submarine signatures were still appearing intermittently on British sensors. The Su-24s had made their passes and delivered their message. Russia had committed fully to its playbook and executed it with the professionalism that comes from decades of Cold War experience. It hadn't worked. Not because the Royal Navy had outmuscled Russia, not because HMS Queen Elizabeth had launched aircraft or fired weapons or done anything that would appear in a military incident report. It hadn't worked because Britain had done something far more sophisticated than muscle, something that took patience and discipline and a very clear understanding of exactly what Russia was trying to achieve. Britain had let Russia run its entire playbook. And then, Britain had changed the game entirely. The decision came from the carrier group commander, not announced, not telegraphed in any way that Russian intelligence monitoring the task force's communication patterns could detect and analyze. Just a quiet order passed through the formation with the efficiency of a naval force that had been training together long enough to move as a single organism. HMS Queen Elizabeth was going to do something Russia had not seen before. The carrier turned. Not away from Russian assets, not toward them in any way that could be read as aggressive. The turn was precise and deliberate and took the carrier group onto a heading that Russian commanders, looking at their charts and their intelligence assessments, could not immediately explain. The formation wasn't following its filed route. It wasn't responding to any obvious external stimulus. It was simply moving somewhere new, with complete confidence. Russian assets began repositioning to follow. That was the first part of what Britain had planned for. The moment Russian vessels began adjusting their positions to maintain surveillance on the carrier group, the British submarine moved. Precisely, decisively, into a position that, had this been a combat situation rather than a Cold War confrontation, would have fundamentally changed the threat picture for every Russian asset in the area. The submarine hadn't been randomly repositioning for days. It had been setting up for exactly this moment. Every small adjustment, every course change, every quiet repositioning had been building toward a single tactical picture. Russia had been so focused on watching the carrier that it hadn't fully tracked what the submarine was doing. That was the gap Britain had been carefully, patiently creating. Above the surface, the F-35s launched in a configuration that Russian analysts hadn't seen before from this task force. Not the standard combat air patrol patterns that had become predictable over the previous days. Something different. A deployment that used the carrier's changed heading to put British aircraft in positions relative to Russian surveillance assets that hadn't existed before. Positions that gave British sensors angles and access to information that all the previous days of contact hadn't provided. Russia was suddenly being read in ways it hadn't been read before. The intelligence ship responded first. Its course change was small but unmistakable to anyone watching its track. For days it had maintained its position with the confidence of an asset that knew exactly what it was doing and exactly how the situation around it was arranged. Now that confidence was gone, the ship was reacting rather than operating, responding to a situation rather than shaping one. In intelligence terms, that is a critical distinction. A surveillance asset that is reacting is an asset that is revealing itself. Every adjustment it makes to maintain its mission tells the people watching it something about how it works, what it prioritizes, where its limits are. The Royal Navy had spent days appearing to simply tolerate the intelligence ship's presence. In reality, it had been cataloging every pattern, every behavior, every decision the Russian crew made. Now those patterns were being used against it. The Russian submarine signatures, intermittent throughout the deployment, became harder to detect rather than easier as the carrier group's changed formation put British sensors in new orientations. That should have made the British picture worse. Instead, it revealed something important. The places where the submarine signatures disappeared told British analysts as much about where the Russian vessel was operating as the places where they appeared. Absence of information is itself information when you know what you are looking for. Britain knew what it was looking for. The Su-24s that had made their dramatic pass days earlier did not return. Russian commanders had run the calculation again after the debrief from that encounter and arrived at a different answer than they had expected. Another pass would not produce a different result. The British task force had already demonstrated how it responded to that kind of pressure. Another pass would simply give the F-35s another opportunity to collect MOTOs, re-information about Russian aircraft behavior under exactly the conditions Moscow least wanted studied. The decision was made to hold the aircraft back, which meant Russia was now operating without the tool that had been designed to create the most visible pressure on the carrier group. The intelligence ship was reacting rather than leading. The submarine was in a position it hadn't chosen. The aircraft were grounded, and HMS Queen Elizabeth was continuing on a heading that Russian commanders still hadn't fully explained to themselves. The shadowing operation had not ended. Russia had not packed up and gone home. Professional militaries don't do that. They adapt and continue and look for new angles. But something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the encounter, and everyone on both sides understood it, even if neither side would ever say it directly. Russia had come to this confrontation with a plan. Britain had let that plan run until it understood every piece of it. And then Britain had done what the Royal Navy has done for 300 years, when it finds itself in contested waters with an adversary who has mistaken patience for weakness. It reminded them of the difference. As HMS Queen Elizabeth continued into open ocean, the Russian intelligence ship on the horizon grew smaller. Still there, still watching, but watching from further away than it had intended, in a position it hadn't chosen, with less information than it had expected to have at this stage of the operation. In Moscow, analysts were writing assessments that would take weeks to fully complete. In London, the Royal Navy already knew what those assessments would conclude. They had written the outcome themselves. Russia had sent everything it had to shadow the most powerful warship Britain had ever built. HMS Queen Elizabeth hadn't just refused to blink. She had made Russia question whether it had ever understood what it was dealing with. Some lessons are expensive. This one, Russia paid for in full